So thanks for joining us. My name's Chad, as usual, and joining me today is Brandon Routman. So Brandon is a senior behavioral scientist at Attuned. In the past, he's worked for the Behavioral Insights team, aka the Nudge Unit, working on a very important project for us, which hopefully you'll learn a little bit about today, and also the Brookings Institution. He has a graduate degree from the University of Chicago, and he's much taller than he looks on video. And I've heard he's got some basketball skills, but I can't verify that myself just yet. So as usual, the Q&A will follow the presentation, and we'll use the Zoom Q&A feature. So if you look in the kind of taskbar below, you'll find Q&A. You can put in your questions there. Please type in your questions at any time, although we won't stop, right? So if you raise your hand, sorry, we're going to go until the end. Please use the Q&A feature. With that, let me hand it over to Brandon. Brandon, please take it away.
Thank you, Chad. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Today, I'd like to talk about nudging for motivation. So I want to start where I think most presentations probably should start, Beyonce. In case you missed it, Beyonce recently released a new single called Break My Soul. I urge you to listen to it. It's really good. I also would urge you to take a look at the lyrics. So they're about quitting your job. Here's some of them. She says, I just quit my job. I'm going to find new drive. Damn, they work me so hard. Work by 9, off by 5. They work my nerves. I can't sleep at night. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think Beyonce has sort of captured the zeitgeist. You might have heard that millions of Americans have quit their job in the past couple of years. It's been called the Great Resignation. And I think Beyonce's song sort of captures the moment, captures the sort of era that we're living in. But I'd also point out that it's not just that people are resigning, it's also that a lot of employees are feeling burnt out. So there was a Gallup study run in 2018 before the pandemic, and it found that about a quarter of employees who were surveyed feel burnt out very often or always. And in addition to that number, about 44% of employees feel burnt out sometimes. I think it's probably safe to say that the pandemic has not decreased those numbers, it's probably increased them, if anything. But I'd also point out that it's not just that people are resigning at high rates, and it's not just that people are feeling burnt out, but I think a lot of employees just don't feel engaged by their work. So here's a graphic. Again, it's by Gallup. And the green line shows the percentage of US employees who say that they're engaged by their work. And in 2021, about 36% of people said that they were engaged, which means a lot of people did not. And the blue line represents the actively disengaged. And so in 2021, about 15% of US employees said that they were actively disengaged by their job. Now, these issues are complicated, and there are lots of different ways of thinking about them. But Attuned thinks about them through the lens of motivation. And I think it has a sort of idiosyncratic way of thinking about motivation, which I'd like to explain a little bit. Okay, so it sees motivation as really driven by 11 different sort of factors. So altruism and competition and status and feedback, we sort of think of these as the building blocks for motivation. And if you haven't already, I'd sort of encourage you to take a look at our website and take a free psychometric assessment that we've created. It takes about 10 minutes or so. And once you're done with it, it will show you your psychological profile. So here is one example. This person is really motivated by a sense of rationality. That means he likes it when there's sort of argumentation, and there's a very clear process by which to do a project. Now, this might be true for him, but might not be true for other colleagues, but it's really important to know. So here at Attuned, we basically take this sort of individual psychology, individual person's psychology, and we pair it with ideas from behavioral science, and specifically sort of the practice of nudging. So if you've signed up for this webinar, I think it's probably safe to say you already know a bit or two about behavioral science and nudging, so I'm not going to define them. But I will give you 3 different examples from the field of behavioral science that deal with nudges to try to give you a sense of the behavioral science that we think about here at Attuned. Okay, so study 1. Let's just state the obvious. There is a hierarchy in the workplace. So some people are at the top, some people are at the bottom, and many people at the bottom feel undervalued or underappreciated. So, one example is nurses compared to doctors. Obviously, doctors have a sort of higher status in a hospital setting, and so nurses have somewhat lower status and might feel sort of underappreciated as a result. But the group I want to talk to you today about are 911 call dispatchers. So these are the people that you call up in an emergency. If your spouse has been in a car accident, or you see someone having a heart attack or something like this. And I feel like I'm pointing out the obvious when I say these call dispatchers encounter traumatic situations, but they also often lack the support and the recognition that police officers receive. So if there's a hierarchy here, police officers are above the call dispatchers. And I'd also point out that 911 call dispatchers have really high rates of burnout and resignation, probably as a result, in part, due to a sort of lower sense of status. And so the question you could ask, well, is, can behavioral science help? Specifically, could a nudge boost their sense of status and thereby reduce their level of burnout and their sort of level of turnover? So there was a randomized controlled trial, which I'll call an RCT, that investigated this particular issue. So here's how it worked. There were 500 dispatchers, and they were randomly divided into a control group and a treatment group. And the control group received one email, and it looks something like this. We're collecting stories and thoughts about what makes for a good 911 call taker or dispatcher. If you want to share your thoughts and stories, you can do so here. So it's fairly generic email. It's pretty short. Again, it was sent to the control group. Now, the treatment group received 1 email per week for 6 different weeks. So in total, obviously, 6 emails. And these emails aim to strengthen a sense of the professional identity of the call dispatchers. It sought to increase a sense of the social support between them and sought to boost their status in some way. So let me give you an example. One of the emails had to do with a domestic abuse case. So here, a woman had called up 911 and spoke with a dispatcher. The dispatcher sent the police. And when the police entered, the woman was cowering in a corner, and her boyfriend was standing over her with a baseball bat. And the email continues, what we, the call dispatchers, do can be very stressful, sad, and some calls are seemingly unbearable. But what other job allows you just to listen, type, and save a life? Not many. And so hopefully this email illustrates a sort of boost in status that, again, the emails were intended to deliver. Okay, so fast forward a couple months, and both the control group and the treatment group took what's called the Copenhagen Burnout Survey. So they answered questions like, how often do you think I can't take it anymore? And do you have enough energy for family and friends during leisure time, so when you're not at work? And it turns out that people in the treatment group had a lower level of burnout, according to this survey. So they scored 8 fewer points on average out of a scale of 100. So if there are any stats nerds out there, that's a standard deviation of 0.4. So it's pretty significant. But here's the really interesting thing. The researchers also looked at who resigned from the job. And this graph illustrates that. So on the x-axis, there's weeks after the first email, so basically time. And on the y-axis, there's the percentage of people who stay at their job. And the blue line represents people in the control group, and the red line represents people in the treatment group. And so, as you can see, week 1 or week 0, everybody in the control group and the treatment group remained at their jobs. Nobody had quit. But by week 24, many people in the control group had quit from the control, but fewer people had quit from the group, the treatment group. And specifically, if you had received all 6 emails in the treatment group, then you were 50% less likely to resign from your job. Now, I point out that emails are really, really cheap, but resignations are expensive, right? If a person resigns, then you have to hire a new worker, and that costs a lot of money. And so what the experimenters did was they estimated how much a city of 100 dispatchers would save if they scaled up the intervention. And it turns out that a city would save about $170,000 if they sent just 6 emails to all of their dispatchers. So this intervention is incredibly cost effective. Okay, so that was study 1. Study 2 dealt with call center workers. So these are the people who call you up to sell you things or to ask you for money. Maybe they call up during dinner or something like that. And these are the people that you call if you have questions or need some help from a large organization, like your bank or like your insurance company. And the job is not fun. It's often boring. It's often repetitive. These workers often read from a script. And it entails frequent rejection. So people saying, I don't want what you're selling. And it entails harsh feedback. So people being kind of mean about it. And it's not surprising that these workers have high levels of dissatisfaction and disengagement and high turnover as well. So there was one stat that I read which said if you hire 100 call center workers, 37 of them will have quit by within the first 6 months. Okay, so could behavioral science help in this case? There was a randomized controlled trial that investigated whether a nudge could help. And specifically, it looked at a group of call center workers who were employed by a university, and their job was to contact alumni of the university to ask for donations. And specifically, the donations were used for scholarship money for students who couldn't afford to pay for tuition otherwise. And so these workers were divided into groups. One group we'll call the letter group, read a letter from the scholarship recipient, basically expressing appreciation for their work. Reading the letter took only about 5 minutes or so. And then this group discussed the letter amongst itself. And that also took about 5 minutes. So that was the letter group. There was another group called the Interpersonal Contact Group, and they read the exact same letter. Again, it took 5 minutes, but then the author of the letter entered the room, and the group talked with him for about 5 minutes. So they talked about, what kind of classes the author was taking in school, what he was going to do after he graduated, this sort of thing. And the interaction went really well. So the scholarship student was extremely kind and appreciative toward the callers, and the callers were amazingly respectful towards the student. And the experimenters were interested in whether this interaction would impact the motivation and performance of the callers. And specifically, they were interested in two things. So one was time on the phone. And this you can sort of think of as a proxy measure for their motivation, right? So if a caller is on the phone for his entire shift, that means he's really motivated. But if he's only on the phone for half of his shift and he's taking a coffee break for the other half, then he might not be motivated, right? So the experimenters were interested in time on the phone, but also the amount of money raised, which sort of captures performance on the job. And specifically, the experimenters collected 1 week's worth of data, 2 weeks before the intervention, and also 1 month after the intervention, that there was a clear sort of before-after comparison to be made. So here are the results. This refers just to the first group, the letter group. And on the y-axis, you'll see the minutes on the phone per week. Again, this is a proxy measure for effort or motivation. And the line is pretty flat. So just reading the letter and having a discussion about it with your colleagues didn't increase motivation particularly. The same is also true for performance. So the y-axis on this graph shows the total donation amount per week. Again, it's pretty flat. Now, it's a very different story for the second group. So again, these were the people who actually spoke with the author of the letter. And for them, this interaction dramatically increased the minutes on the phone per week. So these individuals seemed like they were a lot more motivated to do their job. And they seemed to do their job better. So again, the y-axis on this graph shows the total donation per week, and it goes up after the intervention. So you could say, well, how much exactly? The interpersonal group spent 2.4 times more time on the phone, and they raised 2.7 times more money compared to their earlier selves, compared to the baseline. So it was pretty dramatic improvement. Now, the intervention lasted all of 10 minutes. And I think it's probably safe to say that it tapped into people's sense of altruism. So it showed workers that their efforts were really helping others in a very kind of tangible way. And I would suggest that all other organizations can do this more. And so I just ask a rhetorical question to audience members: how might yours? So I'm not going to pick on anybody here, but if you could keep this question in the back of your mind, I'd love to maybe discuss it in the Q&A if you have some thoughts. Okay, so that was study 2. Study 3 dealt with feedback. So I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you, feedback is really common in the workplace. Managers give it to their workers, colleagues give it to each other. But here's a kind of uncomfortable question. Is it useful? Does feedback actually improve the future performance of a worker who has received it? And here, the evidence is kind of mixed. So there was one large meta-analysis, which means that it was analyzing lots of other studies, and it had somewhat ambiguous results, right? It said that feedback could have a positive impact on future performance, but it could also have no impact. And so I think a reasonable question to ask here is, well, why might it not have a positive impact? And there are different answers to this question, but one is that people might already know the feedback on some level. And so the issue is not, information, it's motivation. I think there's a really nice study on this idea, and it comes from a school setting. So here's how it worked. Again, it was a randomized controlled trial, and it was on about 2,000 high school students in America. And so if you imagine these students entering a computer lab, and they're asked what class they would most like to improve at. And we'll call that the target class. We'll come back to that in a second. And then after they answered this question, they were again divided into a control group or a treatment group. And the control group was asked a series of questions like the one shown below. In the last 24 hours, how much time did you spend on social media, Instagram, Snapchat, etc.? This actually, the answers actually go up to 5 hours or more. I was interested in noting. So the control group was asked questions like this, but it really didn't have much to do with the study because the treatment group was asked the same questions. But also really importantly, the treatment group was also asked to give advice to younger students. And this took the form of 14 different questions, and it lasted about 8 minutes. So let me give you a couple of examples. The one question the treatment group was asked was, what is your one best tip for how to prepare for a big test? Just write a sentence or two. Another question was, what's your advice about listening to music while studying? And the 3 answer choices are, no way, it's distracting to have music. The second answer choice is, absolutely, it makes studying more enjoyable. And the third is, it depends. Some music can be distracting, but if you pick the right tunes, it can improve attention. That's second example. A third example reads, finally, considering all the things you could advise another student to do to improve their grades, write a letter to another student hoping to do better in school. Keep it short, just a sentence or two. And the researchers were interested in whether giving advice to these other students affected one's own grades in math class. So math class is, as you might imagine, not everybody's favorite. The answer to this question was, it does. So the treatment group is represented by the black bar, the control group is represented by the white bar, and the sort of length of these 2 bars represents how well the students did in class. And turns out the treatment group did better than the control group. And you can also ask the same question about the target class. Remember, this is the class that students said they wanted to improve at. And it turns out here too, giving advice to other students increased your own grades. Again, black bar represents the treatment group, white bar, the control group. And so you could ask, well, how impressive was this result, right? There was a little bit of improvement, but it wasn't dramatic. And so what the researchers did was they benchmarked these results with others. That is to say, they looked at hundreds of other studies that had the same goal, i.e., how do you increase student performance? And they said that this particular intervention was within the 50th and 70th percentile in terms of its effect size. So it's not the absolute best thing you could do to increase student performance, but it's substantial. It's significant. But I think where the study really shines is cost. So the per pupil marginal cost here ranked in the first percentile. It was essentially free. And so again, this was a incredibly cost-effective way to boost performance. You could also ask, well, how does this work exactly? Why does giving advice to another student increase your own performance? And here I think the authors don't really state a definitive conclusion. They give a couple of different options. They say, look, a student might feel hypocritical if he gives advice, but he doesn't take his own advice. So this might relate to a term in psychology called cognitive dissonance. The second explanation is that students might be sort of prompted to make concrete plans to study more or to study differently if they have given advice to others. And a third option is that students might have an increased sense of confidence. So you can imagine a student being asked for their advice and then thinking, if I'm being asked for my advice on how to perform well in school, that must mean somebody thinks I'm worthy of being asked for advice. And so that might, that sort of subtle message might prompt them to do better. Okay, so those are the three examples I wanted to talk about. I would say that, look, these deal with interventions in very specific environments, but I think they illustrate principles that could be applied more generally across lots of different environments. I'd also point out that the interventions described were effective across people, so they work on average. But I think it's likely that they'll be particularly effective for certain kinds of people. And that's where I see Attuned really coming in. So just to give you an example of what I mean, let's talk about an employee A. Let's call her Mary. So let's say Mary is motivated by status, and we know that because of Attuned software. Well, let's also assume that she feels undervalued at her job. It might be that she might be less likely to burn out or resign if she was sent a status boosting message in the way that 911 call dispatchers were. Now let's talk about Bob. So say Bob is motivated by a sense of altruism. Again, we would know that because of Bob's test results from the Attuned's psychometric assessment. But say he lacks a certain outlet for that altruism. Well, he might be a good candidate to introduce to the people that he serves, right? He might be motivated by that sort of interpersonal contact in the way that call center workers were motivated by speaking to the scholarship student. And then finally, let's talk about employee C. Let's call her Julie. And let's say she's not motivated by feedback, which is, again, something that Attuned would help us know. But she's also a poor performer. And so her manager needs to increase her performance. And so maybe the manager might benefit by asking Julie to give advice to others in the same way that students improve their performance by giving advice to other students. So I want to emphasize these are hypotheses. They should be tested. But this is the kind of work that Attuned does. So watch this space. And I think with that, I'd like to open it up to Q&A, but maybe before I do, I want to make a small plug to Chad, who will be giving one of these webinars on the 29th, if that's if my memory serves. So
thank you very much, Brandon. Appreciate that, and thank you very much for the presentation. It's super interesting, and there's kind of a lot that we could dig into. If you do have questions, I've gotten a few already, but if you would like to put a question in the Q&A, you can do that just by typing it into Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer all of the questions that we get. So Brendan, my first question, actually, I want to ask something myself. And what I was thinking about is, like, you have three clear examples. So one with status, one with altruism, one with feedback. And as you point out at the end, like it's sometimes useful to look at the individual, right? Like in terms of, if you want to have the highest impact, I think looking at the individual motivators. But in your research, have you found that particular nudges are more effective? For example, like, you know, there's been a lot of studies done on altruism, and kind of like you asked the question, does feedback help? And a lot of people say, does altruism exist? But there's been a lot of studies done on that. Like, is there something that on the whole tends to be more effective that you've seen?
In terms of altruism or feedback, or
sorry, any of the motivators or any type of nudge?
So, you know, there are lots of different nudges, and they have sort of varying effects, or varying effect sizes. I mean, if your question is, okay, well, what kinds of nudges are most effective? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So, you know, I think the immediate answer that springs to mind would be like a default. So, you know, the sort of classic example of the power of a default is that, you know, if you ask people to sign up for retirement savings, some of them do, some of them don't. But if you automatically enroll people into a retirement savings plan, relatively few people opt out of the plan. So this is the sort of classic example that behavioral scientists like to talk about. And, you know, it basically shows the power of sort of inaction, or just going with the flow. Now, you know, I want to sort of stress that behavioral science has been around for a long time now, and it's produced a lot of different ideas as far as how to nudge people. So there's sort of a lot to draw from, and sort of think about in terms of really trying to accomplish anything.
Thank you, Brandon. So I want to get to one of the questions that we have. So we have a question, which is, given that there is an issue of reproducibility with a lot of the behavioral experiments, are the nudges replicable?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. You're absolutely right. The premise is correct. There is a reproducibility crisis in some parts of psychology, specifically priming. I think this has been admitted to even by people like Daniel Kahneman, who, you know, wrote the classic book Thinking Fast and Slow. Now, I would say we shouldn't necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is to say, if there are some things that don't reproduce, that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, everything doesn't reproduce. These particular studies I thought were very well run. And so, you know, I think it's, although I don't know whether these were reproduced or not, I think it's some of our best as a field. Now, you know, I would say there are many studies that do reproduce. So I don't want to give too negative an assessment of the field. But, you know, fundamentally, this is the reason why we test. So, you know, I think, you know, one of my final slides said, look, we can create hypotheses based on this stuff, but it's really important to test it for yourself and test it in your own context. And I think we genuinely do mean that.
Thanks. And I think just from my own personal experience, like some of these things definitely work. They work. It's easier to observe the results on a one-to-one basis, though. And I think that's kind of, what you were sort of alluding to in the end is like we have the power, if we understand a person's intrinsic motivators, we have the power to more directly sort of nudge them, in kind of a more personal way, right? And I think that from my experience is very, very effective, right? So all the examples that you gave at the end really resonated with me. Let me take the next question. So the next question is an interesting one. So in the first study, there was an email that had a kind of a profound impact on the people that it was sent to. And the second one, that the letter didn't have an impact, but the personal appearance did. What is there any kind of explanation for that? Like why or when a written email or a letter might be effective versus when it's not?
Yeah, so I would be reluctant to generalize principles based on these two studies. If you sort of press me, I would say something like, I think there might be an element of surprise that's important. It might be more common for people in the call center to read things about how they're helping, how they're helping a scholarship student pay for his education. But it might be kind of a surprise for them to actually talk with that person, right? And similarly, there might be an element of surprise for the call dispatchers who maybe don't usually get those kinds of emails that talk about how important their work is. I don't want to say I don't want to sort of extract a generalization from these two studies, to say, okay, here's the case when interpersonal contact will always beat some kind of email or letter. But I guess I would suggest that sort of element of surprise might be part of the story.
Interesting, thank you. You raised the question, and we've gotten a question here as well about how can we apply these things, right, in our business. And I was wondering if from the three case studies that you've provided here and your work with Attuned, do you think there's anything that businesses should be doing in terms of nudges that would really, again, like there's probably not, the data that supports like exactly like, okay, you should do this 100%, but is there some kind of like, hey, this would be great if you did it, like it's not going to have a negative effect, it might have a net positive effect? Is there anything like that you would suggest for the attendees if they're interested in trying something for themselves?
Yeah, I do think it's important to understand the particular environment you're working in. My advice might be different for a really large organization, Fortune 500 company, than it would be for, a small startup. That would be my first point. My second point would be it very much depends on the particular goals of the organization. But I do think that the kind of great things about one of the great things about nudges is they're usually cheap and they're usually easy to implement, and so you can try them out, right? If you are working with a group, if your employers are serving a group of people who you could have access to, why not bring them in and try to foster some kind of interaction between the employees and the people that they serve? So just to give you one example, At Attuned, one of our clients is a manufacturer of automobile parts. And one of the things that they manufacture are seatbelts and airbags. And wouldn't it be interesting if they brought in somebody whose life had been saved by the airbag or seatbelt, and you brought them into the office, or you brought them into a Zoom meeting with employees, and you had that person basically express their appreciation for their employees' work. I think that could be really, really powerful. It's a nice reminder that what they were doing saved this person's life. And, I think that can be really motivating compared to maybe more traditional carrots or sticks that management might use.
Absolutely, Brandon. Thank you so much. I think we're out of questions and we're just about out of time. I want to thank you, Brandon, for putting together the wonderful presentation. I'd like to thank everyone who's attending today. And we hope to see you in the next webinar in July. So we'll be sending the official invites out soon. And you can join me. We'll talk a little bit about ways that you can motivate your remote employees. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great evening ahead of you or day, depending on where you're at in the world. Thanks a lot.